Snow lay thick across the fjords, and the sun barely rose above the horizon. The Vikings called this time of year the dark months, when days felt like twilight and nights lasted forever. Surviving this season was a test of skill and preparation, and for families and longhouses, the first frost marked the start of a careful routine. Everything done in spring, summer, and autumn led to this moment. If they had worked well, they could endure. If not, winter could be deadly. The longhouse was their first line of defense, built low to the ground and often half sunk into the earth. It used nature itself as insulation. Walls of timber were packed with moss and turf. Roofs were layered with sod so thick that grass sometimes grew on top, a living blanket against the wind. Inside, there were few windows. Every doorway was small and hung with heavy skins. These details kept heat in and cold out, making the single fire in the center of the hall enough to warm the whole space. Smoke drifted upward and escaped slowly through a vent in the roof, carrying the smell of wood and cooking meat. The heart of the longhouse was the hearth. Here, a fire burned day and night through the winter months. Ashes from the night before were raked back in the morning, and a few coals coaxed into flame again. Families gathered around the glow to eat, mend clothes, carve tools, or tell stories. The heat of the fire dried damp wool and kept frost from forming on the walls. It also allowed cooking without stepping into the freezing wind. Clothing made survival possible too. Before winter came, women and older children spun thick wool into yarn and wove it into tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Every person owned several layers. On top of the wool came fur or leather. Boots were lined with fur and stuffed with straw to trap warmth. This clothing was heavy but life-saving when the temperature plunged. As the first snow fell, the family shifted its daily habits. Livestock that had grazed outdoors all summer was now brought inside. In the back of the longhouse, behind a low wooden partition, cows and goats huddled together. Their body heat added to the warmth of the building, and they were easier to protect from predators and storms. Children learned to move carefully among the animals, feeding them hay stored in lofts above and collecting milk without spilling. By the time night fell, which came early in winter, everyone retreated to the inner part of the house. Straw mattresses lined with blankets of wool and fur created nests of warmth. People often slept close together, sharing body heat. Outside, the wind howled over the frozen land. Inside, the longhouse glowed with firelight and quiet murmurs. This was only the beginning of the long winter, but the family knew they were ready. Their home, clothing, and planning were their shield against the dark season ahead. Outside the longhouse, the world was white and silent, but inside, life continued. The Vikings knew that warmth alone would not carry them through the winter. Food was just as important. In the months before the first snow, they had worked tirelessly to store enough supplies. Every salted fish, every smoked cut of meat, every sack of grain was a promise that their family would see spring again. Preservation began in summer. Fish caught in great numbers were cleaned, salted, and hung to dry on wooden racks until they became hard like boards. This dried fish could last for months. Hunters brought home game from the forests, elk, boar, and deer, and the meat was smoked over slow fires or packed with salt in wooden barrels. The smell of smoke and salt filled the storage huts and drifted into the air around the homestead. Vegetables were prepared to cabbages, onions, and root crops were kept in pits, dug into the earth, lined with straw to keep out frost. In some households, barrels of fermented vegetables were sealed and stored in the coolest corner of the longhouse. Grain from summer harvests was dried and milled into flour for bread or porridge. Nothing was wasted. Even animal fat was rendered into tallow for cooking or for making lamps to light the long nights. During winter, meals were simple but filling. Thick stews of dried meat, root vegetables, and barley simmered slowly over the hearth fire. The smell of cooking filled the longhouse, a comforting scent when wind whistled outside. Bread baked on flat stones provided energy, while dried berries added a bit of sweetness when supplies allowed. Everyone, from the smallest child to the oldest elder, ate carefully to make sure the stores lasted. Children were taught to respect the food and understand its value. They helped grind grain, stir stews, and fetch water or snow to melt. Even small hands contributed because every bit of work counted when daylight was short and survival depended on preparation. Animals were another source of sustenance. Cows and goats, now living in the back of the longhouse, gave milk that was churned into butter or made into cheese. Chickens laid fewer eggs in winter, but still offered the smell of hay, animals, and wood smoke blended together into the scent of a Viking winter. Harsh, but familiar. On the coldest nights, families gathered around the hearth not only for warmth but for a sense of security. Eating together, telling stories, and sharing tasks created a rhythm that helped them endure. The crackle of the fire and the hum of conversation became a shield against the howling winds outside. Sometimes neighbors visited, bringing news or small gifts of food to trade. Community ties were another lifeline during harsh winters. If one family's stores ran low, another might share. When storms broke, they helped each other clear paths or rescue lost animals. This cooperation was part of why Viking settlements survived in such unforgiving places. Food was more than fuel. It was reassurance that they were not helpless before the cold. Every salted fish, every loaf of bread, every warm drink by the fire was proof of their skill and foresight. As winter deepened, they drew on these stores with care, always thinking of the weeks still to come. This discipline, combined with their sturdy homes and heavy clothing, kept them alive through nights when frost coated the inside of the walls and ice creaked on the fjords. Even with a warm house and stored food, winter nights in the north could be cruel. The fire sometimes burned low, and frost crept into corners of the longhouse. To face this, the Vikings used layers of warmth and careful sleeping arrangements to get through the deepest cold. When darkness fell, the family prepared for sleep like preparing for a small battle. Straw mattresses were spread across the raised benches built along the walls of the longhouse. Over these they laid heavy woolen blankets and animal furs, sheepskin, reindeer hides, or whatever they had. Each layer trapped a little more heat. The youngest children and the elderly slept closest to the hearth, where the coals still glowed red. Adults and older children slept around them, forming a ring of bodies that shared warmth through the night. People did not sleep in separate rooms. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Instead, the entire household bedded down together, sometimes with servants or hired hands, and always with the animals just beyond a wooden partition at the far end. The smell of hay, milk, and manure mixed with the smell of smoke, but the combined body heat raised the temperature of the whole building by several degrees. Even this small increase could mean the difference between waking comfortable and waking numb. Before going to sleep, someone always banked the fire. They spread the coals out under a cover of ash, so that embers would survive until morning. At first light, or before, an adult would rise, rake the ashes, and lay fresh kindling. By the time the others stirred, the hearth would be glowing again. This constant tending of fire was a habit learned young. A single mistake could leave everyone shivering. Clothing doubled as bedding. Vikings often slept in their wool tunics and trousers. Rather than risking the cold to change, cloaks were drawn up over heads like hoods. Children sometimes wore mittens or wrapped their feet in extra cloth to keep toes from freezing. If boots had been wet from chores, they were dried by the fire before bed. A cold boot in the morning could mean frostbite during chores. Noise outside reminded everyone of the cold's danger. Wind rattled at the roof, snow shifted against the walls, and sometimes wolves howled in the distance. Inside, the crackle of the fire and the slow breathing of family and animals formed a steady rhythm. This rhythm was more than background sound. It was reassurance that everyone was still alive and safe. During the longest nights, families used storytelling to fill the hours before sleep. Tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors flowed through the dim firelight. The old recited sagas, the young listened, wrapped in furs. These stories were more than entertainment. They carried lessons about endurance, cleverness, and honor, the very qualities needed to outlast winter. This shared closeness built a kind of resilience. In the warmth of bodies, in the sound of voices, in the glow of the hearth, people found not only heat, but courage. Winter could be harsh, but they met it together. Even the coldest nights became bearable when wrapped in layers of wool, fur, and community. Even in the deepest cold, the Vikings could not spend every hour sitting by the fire. Animals still needed to be fed, tools repaired, water brought in from streams, or snow melted for cooking. Life did not stop because the sun had disappeared behind clouds or the wind cut across the fjord. To survive, they built careful winter routines that balanced work with conservation of energy. Chores began before daylight, which in winter meant before dawn's faint gray glow. One adult rose quietly, raked open the fire's embers, and added small sticks until the flames caught. The warmth and light slowly spread through the longhouse, waking the others. While one person prepared a simple breakfast, often porridge made from barley or oats, another tended the animals in the back. Hay was pulled from lofts above the stalls and shaken down to the cows and goats. Buckets of water, kept from freezing by burying them in straw, were carried to the troughs. Children old enough to help learned quickly that hesitation in the cold could lead to numb fingers. Outside, work was short and deliberate. Wood for the hearth had been stacked high in autumn, cut into manageable lengths, and covered to keep snow off. When more was needed, family members trudged through drifts to bring in armloads. Tools left outdoors would freeze or crack, so even axes and sledges were stored inside. If repairs to boats, sledges, or fences were needed, they were done quickly in a shed or by the firelight of the longhouse itself. Light was scarce, so the Vikings relied on oil lamps carved from stone or iron holders for rushlights dipped in tallow. These flickered but provided enough glow to mend clothes, carve handles, or weave nets. Winter was also the time when women spun the most yarn and wove the heaviest cloth, seated close to the fire with baskets of wool at their feet. Men carved spear shafts, shaped new handles for tools, or whittled wooden toys for children. The smell of wool grease, wood shavings, and smoke filled the hall. Pacing was vital. In summer, days stretched long, and tasks were endless, but winter demanded restraint. People moved slowly to conserve heat and energy. They wrapped cloaks tightly and covered heads and hands before stepping outdoors. Inside, heavy curtains or animal skins were hung over doorways to block drafts, and everyone learned to slip through quickly to keep warmth from escaping. Despite the hardship, these winter routines had a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Chores, meals, crafts, rest, stories. This rhythm anchored families against the shifting winds and endless dark. Each small act, feeding a goat, mending a seam, stirring a pot, was a thread in the net of survival. In this way, the Vikings transformed the coldest months from a threat into a season of discipline and community. By keeping to their winter routines, they maintained their supplies, their homes, and their spirits until the sun returned higher in the sky and ice began to melt. The Vikings understood that survival in winter was not just about heat and food, but also about staying healthy. Long months indoors, close to animals and smoke, could weaken even the strongest bodies. To make it through, families practiced small but steady habits of care that kept illness from spreading and spirits from collapsing. Air inside a longhouse was thick. Smoke from the hearth hung in the rafters, and the smell of damp wool, hay, and sweat filled every corner. To ease this, people opened the small roof vent or door when the weather allowed, letting fresh air sweep through for a short time before closing it again. This quick exchange cleared smoke and foul smells, even if it let in a rush of cold. Personal hygiene was limited by modern standards, but still important. Vikings washed hands and faces with water melted from snow. They combed their hair and beards, not only to look tidy, but to remove lice. They scrubbed clothing with lye soap made from ash and animal fat, rinsing garments in streams when possible. These habits helped reduce the spread of sickness at a time when a single cough could travel fast in a crowded room. Diet also shaped their health. Stews rich with root vegetables, dried meat, and fermented foods provided vitamins that warded off scurvy and weakness. Dried berries and stored honey offered small but valuable bursts of sweetness and energy. Mothers gave children spoonfuls of sour milk or fish oil when it was available, believing it strengthened them against winter fevers. Herbs were another tool. Even in cold months, dried plants from summer gardens hung in bundles from the rafters. Women brewed teas from yarrow, mint, or chamomile to soothe coughs and stomach aches. Smoke from burning juniper was thought to cleanse the air. These simple remedies, passed down through generations, gave families some control over winter illnesses. Equally important was mental strength. Long nights and little sunlight could weigh heavily on people's minds. To fight gloom, families filled evenings with songs, stories, and small games played on carved boards. Men recited sagas of heroes and gods. Women told tales of ancestors. Children carved little animals or spun tops. These acts were not just for amusement, they created a sense of normalcy and hope, a reminder that winter would end. Faith also played a role. Offerings to household spirits, prayers to the gods for health, and rituals at midwinter feasts tied people to something larger than themselves. Believing that divine powers watched over them gave courage when storms roared outside and sickness whispered inside. By combining fresh air, basic cleanliness, careful food storage, herbal remedies, and shared stories, the Vikings strengthened both body and spirit. They knew that winter was a season to endure, not a time to give up. Each day they practiced small acts of care, building a quiet resistance to cold and despair. These habits, humble but effective, were another reason they survived the coldest nights of the year. Winter was also the season when the sea became too dangerous for most voyages. The longships that had cut across summer waters were pulled far up the beach or into shelters of logs and turf. Sails were folded, oars stacked, and hulls coated with tar to keep out moisture. With no raiding or trading journeys to undertake, men who were usually at sea now found themselves at home for months. This change shaped how whole communities lived through the dark season. Ship maintenance became a winter craft. In the dim light of the longhouse or in a small outbuilding, men examined every plank and joint for cracks. They carved new pegs, shaped replacement ribs, and patched leaks with moss and pitch. Ropes were inspected and spliced, sails repaired with thick needles and wool thread. Even children were given small tasks like untangling nets or sorting iron nails. These quiet repairs meant that when ice finally melted, the ships could slip back into water ready for work. The same was true of weapons. Swords, axes, and spears were cleaned of rust and oiled. Handles were replaced, blades sharpened by hand on stone wheels. Hunters did the same with traps and bows. This kept men busy but also gave them a sense of purpose during months when movement was limited and daylight scarce. Indoor crafts flourished. Woodworkers carved bowls, spoons, and furniture. Blacksmiths repaired hinges and forged nails or fittings for ships. Women wove thick cloth, spun yarn, and stitched cloaks and tunics. Children learned by watching and helping, their small fingers turning spindles or scraping bark for kindling. Winter thus became a season of teaching and apprenticeship, when skills were passed down from elders to the young. The long hours indoors also deepened community ties. Neighbors visited more often, trudging through snow to share a meal or news. A storyteller might stop by, carrying fresh tales from a distant settlement. These visits broke the monotony and kept alliances strong. In a world where storms or illness could strike at any time, knowing your neighbors would help you mattered as much as a sharp axe or a well-stocked larder. During especially harsh nights, men might gather in a circle, planning spring voyages or discussing disputes to be settled when travel resumed. The flicker of lamplight across their faces gave these talks an air of quiet intensity. Meanwhile, children played on the floor with carved animals or small dice games, their laughter mixing with the murmur of adult voices and the crackle of the hearth. This blending of maintenance, craft, teaching, and community kept Viking households active and focused. Instead of idleness, winter became a time to prepare for the coming year, to strengthen the tools and ties that would carry them back into the world. When ice receded and sunlight returned, by turning stillness into preparation, the Vikings transformed the harshest months into a season of hidden energy. Beneath the snow and silence, skills were honed, ships mended, clothes woven, and friendships reinforced, all vital for surviving the coldest nights and thriving once the fjords opened again. The middle of winter was also the season of Yule, the great midwinter feast. For the Vikings, this was more than a chance to eat and drink. It was a ritual of survival, a way to push back against darkness and cold, with light, music, and shared strength. The Yule season could last for days, sometimes as long as 2 weeks, depending on how much food and drink a household had saved. In the heart of the coldest time of year, Yule reminded everyone that life still burned bright. Preparation for Yule began months earlier. Extra animals were fattened for slaughter, grain reserved for brewing ale, and honey saved for mead. Women brewed and baked, filling the longhouse with the smell of bread and herbs. Men cut evergreen boughs to decorate the hall. These green branches were more than decoration. They were a sign of life in the dead of winter, a promise that spring would come again. On the first night of Yule, the hearth fire was stoked until it roared. A massive log, the Yule log, was placed in the fire to burn steadily through the night. Its glow lit the hall like sunlight, casting shadows on the rafters and warming faces. Families and neighbors gathered, shedding their heavy cloaks and laughing as the warmth spread. Cups of ale and mead were passed around. People toasted the gods, their ancestors, and each other, asking for health, good harvests, and safe voyages in the year ahead. Food during Yule was rich compared to ordinary winter meals. Roasted meat, fresh bread, cheese, dried fruits, and sweet cakes appeared on the long tables. Children received small treats saved just for this time. Music and storytelling filled the gaps between courses. Someone might strike up a tune on a simple harp or drum, while others sang along. These sounds drowned out the howling wind outside and filled the hall with life. Yule also carried rituals meant to ensure survival. Offerings of food or drink were set aside for the household spirits, the nis or landvetter, believed to protect the home. A little ale might be poured on the ground as a gift to the gods. People carved runes or told omens to glimpse the future. These acts gave a sense of control over the unknown months still ahead. For children, Yule was a time of wonder. They played games, listened wide-eyed to sagas of Thor and Odin, and watched their elders perform old customs. These memories bound them to their culture and to each other, teaching that even in the harshest winter, community and tradition were sources of warmth. When the feast finally ended and the last ember of the Yule log died, people returned to their routines with renewed spirits. The memory of warmth, song, and shared food gave them strength to face the weeks of cold still to come. In this way, Yule was more than a festival. It was a survival strategy, keeping hearts as well as bodies alive through the coldest nights of the year. As the heart of winter deepened and the first glow of Yule faded, survival depended on how well a household managed its food stores. By January, the daylight was still short. Snow lay heavy on the ground and hunting was unreliable. The sea was frozen or stormy, and rivers were blocked with ice. For the Vikings, these weeks tested their discipline and planning. Every family had to stretch its supplies carefully, so that nothing ran out before the thaw. In the longhouse, food storage was an art. Smoked fish and meat hung from the rafters, dark shapes twisting in the rising heat from the fire. Barrels of salted herring, dried cod, and cured pork lined the walls. Cheese sat on wooden shelves, hard and crumbly, but still full of nourishment. Clay jars of grain and beans were sealed with wax or cloth. Even butter was packed in barrels, buried in cool pits, or left outside in the snow to keep it fresh. These stores were the backbone of winter survival. Meals during this time became simpler than the rich feasts of Yule. A pot of stew often bubbled at the edge of the hearth, made from dried peas, root vegetables like turnips or parsnips, and bits of salted meat. Flatbread baked on stones replaced soft loaves. Children chewed on dried apples or berries as treats. Even the ale and mead were rationed more strictly, saved for special occasions or guests. Eating sparingly ensured that the family could last until spring. Fuel was another precious resource. Firewood cut in summer and autumn was stacked high outside, but every log had to be counted. People learned to keep the hearth burning low and steady instead of roaring. Ashes from the fire were saved to insulate pots, and sometimes even to make lye for cleaning. Every scrap of warmth and energy was used wisely. Warm clothing, cloaks of wool, fur-lined boots, mittens of leather, was worn indoors as well as outdoors to reduce the need for more firewood. Work inside the longhouse kept people busy and warm. Women spun wool, mended clothing, and prepared new garments. Men sharpened tools, carved wood, or repaired fishing nets. Children helped with chores, fed animals, or learned new skills from their elders. These tasks were not just about staying productive. They created movement, which kept bodies warm. People understood that idleness meant cold fingers and empty stomachs. Social ties also played a role in survival. Neighbors sometimes visited each other to share news or help with heavy tasks like splitting logs or butchering an animal. In emergencies, households might trade food or fuel. Such exchanges built goodwill that could be repaid later. Isolation could be deadly in winter, so even short visits kept spirits high and strengthened community bonds. The Vikings accepted this period of restraint as part of life. They understood that winter was not just a time of hardship, but of patience and careful stewardship. By managing their food stores, fuel, and energy, they turned scarcity into survival. The long nights taught them discipline and resourcefulness, qualities as important as strength or courage in the far north. When the first signs of thaw appeared, a longer day, a softer wind, dripping from the eaves, people felt a cautious relief. They had endured another stretch of the harshest season. Each successful winter gave a family not only survival, but pride and stories to tell around the fire. These lessons, passed from one generation to the next, ensured that the Vikings could face even the coldest nights with a plan, a hearth, and hope for the spring. By midwinter, when the nights felt endless, even the strongest Viking family felt the strain. This was the season when the mind could suffer as much as the body. Outside, everything was dark, frozen, and still. Inside, people were crowded together in one long room day after day. The smell of smoke, animals, and old food clung to everything. Boredom and frustration could build, and in a time when survival required cooperation, bad tempers were a danger. The Vikings learned ways to keep their spirits steady and their minds sharp. One of the simplest ways to fight the gloom was storytelling. Around the hearth at night, after the chores were done, elders recited sagas of gods, heroes, and great voyages. Children listened with wide eyes. Adults joined in, adding details or debating parts of the story. This wasn't only entertainment. The stories carried lessons about bravery, cunning, loyalty, and endurance. Virtues needed to survive the cold. Speaking and listening also passed the time, breaking up the monotony of long winter evenings. Games were another tool. Wooden board games like Hennefataf, a kind of strategy game, sat on tables near the fire. People carved new playing pieces during the day, then challenged each other at night. Dice carved from bone were thrown to pass a few hours. Friendly competition gave a sense of normality, kept minds active, and stopped small frustrations from growing into quarrels. Music and simple exercise helped. Someone might beat a rhythm on a drum or pluck a harp. People sang work songs softly as they mended clothes or whittled wood. Children were encouraged to move, to run small errands outside, or to help with tasks that required lifting. The small bursts of movement kept their blood warm and their bodies strong. Even sweeping the floor or stirring a heavy pot was a way to stay active. Faith played a part in mental survival. Offerings to household spirits, runic charms carved into beams, or quiet prayers to Thor and Freya gave people a sense of protection. These rituals reassured them that forces larger than themselves watched over their home. In a world where weather, sickness, and hunger could not be controlled, these small acts provided comfort and meaning. Craftwork filled the hours as well. Men carved wood, repaired weapons and tools, or shaped simple toys for children. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and embroidered patterns of animals or knots into garments. These tasks produced things the household needed, but they also gave a sense of progress. Every finished piece of cloth or sharpened tool was proof that time was moving, that winter would not last forever. Even conversation and humor were important. Jokes, riddles, and teasing lightened the mood. A good laugh could warm the hall as much as a log on the fire. Families learned to respect each other's space, to find small ways to keep peace and harmony. Cooperation was not just about sharing food and chores, but about keeping each other's spirits alive. By combining stories, games, faith, craftwork, and simple kindness, the Vikings built a mental shield against the longest nights. Their survival was not only a matter of full larders and warm fires, but of resilient minds. This inner strength, forged each winter, was as essential to their culture as swords or ships. When spring finally returned, families stepped out of their dark halls not only alive, but still whole in spirit, ready to work and travel again. When the days were at their shortest and the sea lay locked in ice, the Vikings' survival often depended on how well they worked together as a family and as a community. A single household could not produce every skill or resource needed for the whole winter. Some families were better at fishing, others at raising livestock or weaving warm cloth. During the hardest part of the year, this network of skills and favors became the lifeline that kept everyone alive. Winter trade and bartering were not like the lively markets of summer. There were no bustling ports, no foreign ships arriving with exotic goods. Instead, exchange happened quietly between neighbors or through small gatherings when the weather allowed. A family with extra fish might swap for wool from another household. Someone with a sturdy sled might help transport firewood from the forest in exchange for a share of the meat. These small trades built webs of mutual aid. This cooperation was not only practical, but also cultural. Norse society valued hospitality and generosity. A guest offered warmth and food on a cold night was expected to return the kindness later. Even a stranger could knock at a door during a snowstorm and expect at least a seat by the fire and a bowl of stew. Such customs reduced the chance of isolation and starvation, especially in regions where winters could be deadly. Inside the longhouse, cooperation also meant dividing chores, so nothing was missed. The older children learned to feed animals and carry water. The adults tended to the fire, prepared meals, and repaired tools. Even the elderly, who might not do heavy work, contributed by telling stories, teaching crafts, or watching the youngest children. Every person had a role. Knowing that each role mattered gave people a sense of purpose during the dark months. Occasionally, whole communities gathered at a larger hall for a midwinter assembly or a shared feast. These meetings were rare in winter, but valuable. They allowed disputes to be settled, alliances renewed, and news shared. People might travel for a day or more through snow and ice to attend, carrying goods to trade and gifts to give. The sense of belonging to something larger than a single household lifted spirits and strengthened social bonds. Mutual aid extended to emergencies too. If a family's roof collapsed under snow or their firewood ran out, neighbors would help rebuild or share supplies. Such help was not charity but investment. Next year, it might be your own house that needed repair. In harsh climates, cooperation was as necessary as food or fire. A reputation for fairness and reliability was worth more than gold. The Vikings also used winter to plan joint ventures for the coming year. Around the fire, men discussed future voyages, trade routes, or building projects. Women planned how much cloth to weave or what herbs to plant in spring. These discussions kept minds looking forward, beyond the cold, and bound families into shared hopes. Through trade, shared labor, hospitality, and planning, the Vikings turned a season of isolation into a season of connection. In the darkest time of year, the warmth of human ties was as important as the heat of the hearth. It was this network of cooperation, quietly maintained each winter, that allowed Viking communities to endure the coldest nights and emerge into spring still strong. The animals outside the longhouse were as vital to survival as the people within it. In a world without supermarkets or trucks, a Viking family's sheep, goats, cows, and horses were living stores of food, clothing, and power. Keeping them alive through the coldest nights of the year was an everyday challenge that required skill and planning. In summer and autumn, animals grazed freely and built up fat. By winter, grass was buried under snow and ice, so the family relied on hay, grain, and dried fodder gathered earlier. Storing enough feed was as important as storing food for people. Whole days in late summer were spent cutting and drying grass, bundling it tightly and stacking it under a roof. If the hay was damp or moldy, animals could sicken. Careful storage meant they could eat well until spring. Shelter was another challenge. In the harshest climates, animals were brought into a byre, a low stable attached to the longhouse itself. The warmth of their bodies added to the heat of the hall, while the people's fire kept the animals from freezing. This arrangement was noisy and smelly, but it made sense. It protected valuable livestock, reduced the distance for carrying feed and water, and saved firewood. Each morning and evening chores revolved around the animals. Children carried buckets of water from a stream or well, breaking the ice on the surface. Adults pitched hay into troughs, checked hooves, and brushed snow from coats. Cows were milked, goats examined for illness, and horses given extra bedding of straw. These routines were tiring, but also gave rhythm to long winter days. In return, the animals provided milk for cheese and butter, wool for spinning, and, when necessary, meat. The Vikings also managed their herds with long-term thinking. Not every animal was slaughtered for Yule. The healthiest were saved for breeding. This ensured that in spring, there would be lambs and calves to replenish the stock. Knowing which animals to cull and which to keep was a form of knowledge passed down through families. A wrong choice could mean hunger next winter. Livestock also played a part in community ties. A neighbor might lend a bull for breeding or share hay in exchange for a piglet later. Such exchanges were acts of trust. These arrangements could save entire herds during harsh storms. Even in the depths of winter, there was a sense of gratitude for the animal's role in survival. Children learned to treat them with respect, to stroke a cow's flank, or speak softly to a horse. These beliefs encouraged care and attention. After all, a sick goat or a frozen chicken could ripple into hunger for the whole family. By keeping their animals warm, fed, and healthy, the Vikings protected their own lifeline. People and animals survived together, sharing warmth, labor, and life until the snow melted and green pastures returned. Deep winter was also a time for quiet work that would pay off when the ice melted. With the fields frozen and the seas blocked, men and women turned their attention to preparation. In a culture built on farming, sailing, and raiding, winter became a workshop and classroom rolled into one. What they did during these dark weeks could mean the difference between a strong spring and a weak one. Inside the longhouse, tools and weapons were brought out one by one to be checked and repaired. Axes were rehafted, spearheads sharpened, and swords polished. Leather straps were replaced, shields mended, and boats' small fittings carved or fixed. In warmer months, there was little time for such careful maintenance. Winter provided that time. Even young boys learned to grind an edge on a blade or shape wooden pegs, while older men taught them the reasons behind each step. A sharp axe cut more firewood with less effort. A well-balanced spear could save your life. Women's work was equally crucial. With looms set up near the hearth, they spun wool into yarn and wove heavy cloth. Some cloth was dyed with the last of the summer's plants, creating stripes and patterns. This fabric would be sewn into cloaks, tunics, and sails. A ship's sail was as important as its hull. Winter weaving meant a ship could leave on schedule once the sea opened. Children helped card wool or wound thread into balls, learning skills that would keep their families clothed for life. Even cooking in winter had a forward-looking side. The broth from a stew was thickened with leftover grains to stretch it further. Bones were boiled to make stock, then cracked to get the marrow. Nothing was wasted. Sometimes meat was smoked again or salted a second time to extend its life. Herbs saved from autumn were added not only for flavor, but to keep food from spoiling. These habits built a margin of safety into the household's supplies. Winter also allowed planning around the fire. Men spoke of potential trade voyages, which rivers to travel, which towns to visit or raid. Women discussed planting, births, and how to allocate wool or cloth. Older people told stories that doubled as lessons in navigation, law, and survival. These talks linked generations. They also gave everyone a sense of direction. Instead of feeling trapped by snow and darkness, they were shaping the future. Occasionally, someone would carve runes on a piece of wood or bone, marking the name of a place, a god, or a promise. These carvings might be sewn into clothing or carried as charms. They were small reminders of purpose and hope, tokens that winter was a time of waiting, not stagnation. By treating the frozen months as a season of preparation rather than idleness, the Vikings kept their culture moving forward even when nature forced them indoors. When the ice finally broke and the first green shoots appeared, their ships were ready, their clothes were strong, their weapons were sharp, and their minds were focused. This rhythm of work and rest, maintenance and planning, was one of the keys to surviving not only the coldest nights, but the harsh northern life itself. By the late winter, when the nights were still long, but the sun had begun to return, sickness often became a greater threat than the cold itself. Weeks of being crowded inside, breathing smoky air and eating preserved food could weaken even the strongest body. For the Vikings, preventing and treating illness during the coldest months was another skill of survival. Clean water was the first line of defense. Streams and rivers were often frozen, so families had to break ice and carry buckets back to the longhouse. Sometimes snow was melted over the fire, but that used precious fuel. Water for drinking and cooking was kept covered to stop dust or animals from contaminating it. Although people did not understand germs in the modern sense, they knew that stale or dirty water could make you sick. Herbs gathered in summer and autumn were stored in small bags or jars. These were the Vikings' medicine cabinet. Dried chamomile, yarrow, angelica, and juniper berries might be brewed into teas for fevers, coughs, or stomach pains. Garlic and onion were added to broths as both flavor and remedy. Honey, prized for its sweetness, was also used on wounds to help them heal. Women, especially older women, often acted as healers, remembering which plants worked for which troubles. Smoke and steam played a role in winter health. Sometimes herbs were burned to clean the air or to ease breathing. Steam from boiling water was inhaled to relieve congestion. Even simple practices like airing out bedding on cold sunny days helped reduce pests. These customs did not always prevent illness, but they increased comfort and gave a sense of action against unseen forces. When someone did fall sick, care was a family effort. Warm furs and extra cloaks were piled on the patient. Hot drinks were prepared, and tasks were shared so the sick person could rest. In serious cases, neighbors might be called to help, bringing different herbs or knowledge. If a healer or seer lived nearby, they might be summoned to chant or use charms, blending spiritual and practical care. Spirits and gods were also invoked. Offerings might be made to Ire, a goddess associated with healing, or to household spirits believed to guard against misfortune. These rituals gave hope and focus to worried families. In a world where a cough could turn deadly, any act that promised protection was worth trying. The Vikings also understood the importance of strength before sickness struck. In winter, even simple exercise like splitting wood or moving snow kept bodies fit. Eating a mix of preserved meats, grains, and dairy maintained energy. Sharing food fairly meant no one became weak from hunger. These habits built resilience so that when illness did appear, the body had a better chance of recovery. By combining herbal knowledge, hygiene, rest, and community support, the Vikings managed to endure the health challenges of long winters. They could not prevent every loss, but their efforts reduced the dangers and increased survival. Each healed wound, each recovered child, was proof that their methods worked well enough to carry them through until spring. As the sun began to climb a little higher and the snow softened on the roofs, Viking families turned their eyes to the world outside their walls. Late winter and early spring were a bridge between endurance and renewal. Surviving the coldest nights was not only about keeping warm, but also about knowing when and how to shift back into action as the seasons changed. This was the time to check tools and stores one more time. Axes and saws needed to be ready for cutting fresh timber. Farmers inspected their seed grain and repaired fences in anticipation of animals returning to pasture. Anything broken over winter had to be mended now, before the burst of spring work arrived. In these weeks, the longhouse became a busy workshop once again. Hunting and fishing slowly resumed as ice retreated. Women gathered early greens sprouting in sheltered spots, adding them to stews for much-needed vitamins. These small additions refreshed bodies weary of winter fare. The change of season also brought rituals of thanks. Families gave small offerings to land and sea spirits, thanking them for protection through the dark months and asking for fertile fields and safe voyages ahead. Children were taught these customs as a way of linking hard survival to gratitude and hope. Lighting a small bonfire outside, scattering grain for birds, or pouring a little ale onto thawing ground were all gestures of renewal. Social life revived to neighbors who had seen each other only occasionally over winter. Information about travel conditions, trade opportunities, and marriages was exchanged. This flow of news helped families plan the next steps. Some might prepare to sail for trade, others to plant fields or build new houses. The community's pulse quickened as daylight grew. Health also improved with fresh air. People opened doors and shutters more often to let smoke out and sunlight in. Bedding and clothing were aired and beaten to remove pests. Children played outside for longer, their laughter a sign that the worst of winter was ending. Movement and fresh food restored energy and moods. This period required careful judgment. A sudden storm could still strike, and supplies had to last until the first true harvest or trading voyage. Wise families balanced eagerness with caution, slowly increasing activity without exhausting their stores or strength too soon. Those who managed this balance emerged from winter, not only alive, but prepared for the work ahead. Late winter and early spring were a lesson in patience and planning. The Vikings knew that survival was not a single moment, but a cycle. Each cold night endured, each small task completed, each ritual observed, built toward the moment when doors could open and life could expand again. In this way, they turned the edge of winter into a time of readiness, carrying forward the resilience that had seen them through the darkest days. When the first true warmth finally came, the transformation of the Viking world was sudden and dramatic. Streams broke free from their ice, the sea opened, and fields that had been hard and gray for months turned soft enough to plow. The people who had huddled through the darkness poured back out into the light, carrying with them the habits, skills, and strength that had seen them through the coldest nights. This was the season of rebuilding and rebirth. The longhouse, which had been a shelter and a workshop, was aired and cleaned from end to end. Floors were swept, walls scrubbed with branches, and fresh rushes laid down. Soot from months of fires was brushed away. The smell of fresh greenery replaced the heavy smoke of winter. Bedding was beaten in the wind, Furs were hung in sunlight, and clothes were mended for outdoor work. Even the animals sensed the change, stepping into pastures with eager energy. Fields demanded attention first. Men and women together broke the ground with wooden plows tipped in iron. Seeds saved from the previous harvest were carefully planted. Livestock were moved to new grazing areas, and new pens were built for lambs and calves. Children collected stones from the fields, learning the cycle of labor that would feed them next winter. Everything done now would decide how much food and fodder the household would have when the snow came again. Ships were also brought out and checked. Hulls were caulked, sails unrolled and mended, ropes spliced. Men inspected their weapons and tools, thinking ahead to trade, fishing, and voyages. A family might send 1 or 2 members south with goods to exchange, while the rest stayed to tend fields. The long, dark planning of winter now became action. But spring was not just work, it was celebration. Families held small feasts to mark their survival. Offerings of thanks were given to the gods and land spirits. Children were told again the stories of winter survival, not just as entertainment, but as a reminder of what patience, courage, and cooperation could achieve. These tales prepared them for the winters they would face as adults. The hardships of winter had forged strong bonds. Neighbors who had helped one another shared news and laughter in the sun. Promises made by the hearth in December were fulfilled in the open air. Plans whispered over stews became projects built with hammers and saws. Each spring carried the quiet pride of a victory, won without swords, the victory of endurance. Surviving the coldest nights of the year was never just about one skill. It was the whole rhythm of their lives. It was the careful storing of food and fodder, the weaving of cloth, the tending of animals, the telling of stories, the keeping of faith, the sharing of work, and the planning of journeys. It was a culture built to withstand the North. When a Viking family stepped into the new sunlight after months in the longhouse, they carried more than just relief. They carried the knowledge that, together, they could face the darkness again. This confidence was as valuable as any weapon or ship. It allowed them not only to endure their harsh homeland, but to travel far across seas, to build settlements, and to thrive in places other people feared. That spirit, forged in long nights and frozen fields, was at the heart of who they were.